Hi, I'm the True Wise Gamer, giving off my vast knowledge so you may understand games a bit better. The Evil Within as a game is a strange game to talk about for the most part, since a lot of people have said a lot of things about these games, and usually as time goes on, a conversation around a game can usually calcify or just stop moving. It basically stopped happening, or at least go into circles until a new subject matter that can be gleaned from it can be viewed upon it. And I believe, ironically, I have a chance to talk about this game in a weird way than I think a lot of people would have ever talked about this game. Or at least in a gameplay sense. In a story sense, I might not really, but may say it in a weird way. But that's just me in general. But that could be talked about in the review. Let's actually talk about the developers for a moment. And like in my last review, we're talking about a company that basically died for no real good reason, even though they released banger after banger after banger. All because they just wanted to please the shareholders, nothing more. Closed down for no good reason. And this was especially weird after the fact they made Hi-Fi Rush, one of the best games they've ever made. Don't at me. Granted, Tango Gameworks is now back in making the sequel to Hi-Fi Rush, but I'm just making the point that it shouldn't have happened to begin with. You know what I mean? Especially when you remember that the company was made by Shinji Mikami after his departure from Capcom for creative purposes, and after working with Suda51 with Shadows of the Dam, which has its own set of fraud and history with it, founded his own game company, Tango Gameworks, and The Evil Within was their first game to come out. Look, people, there are so many videos out there who can talk about this whole company and the history of Shinji Mikami. I don't want to be a repeater of someone else's repetition of the same information. You can literally just go watch them, and I recommend a few. Here are a few now. Sometimes I don't want to just repeat what other people said unless I can genuinely add something, and I really can't. So let's just talk about The Evil Within, or Psycho Break, which honestly is a better name in general. I'm not sure why they changed the name. It's like, come on. The game begins with our main character, Sebastian Conchianos, as he's heading to a crime scene with Officer Deadman Walking. I could remember his name, but do you? Anyway, his partner Joseph and the new rookie Kidman. They are heading to the nearby hospital that's having some weird incident happening, but as they approach it, they hear a weird noise that basically everyone is hearing except Kidman. This will be important later. As they arrive, it's basically a slaughter, a bloodbath, as everyone is dead, and while trying to figure out what exactly happened, you notice that some cops are dying to a scarred man who is able to teleport and teleports us, grabbing us, knocking us out as we are hanging upside down as we see another scarred man chopping up some people. We do try to make our escape, though it goes poorly, and I'm pretty sure he got some diseases along the way. And after escaping and heading into the city, it begins collapsing as he tries to escape. He's with Deadman and Kidman. Joseph, I don't know where Joseph is. He kind of just disappears a lot of the time. We'll talk about that later. But we also find Dr. Jimenez and his patient Leslie, who's a bit mental. After some driving and some hectic shit going on, we soon see Deadman turning into something as he crashes into something as we begin the game and try to figure out what the hell is going on. Though to say that last part implies you are actually trying to figure stuff out rather than stumbling into it. Let me explain. There's never a real, here's what's going on, you know what I mean? More times than not, it just becomes this sort of problem where the plot doesn't really want to move on, and it's just about surviving the individual moments rather than any arcing plot in the story, which is fine in some regard, but in a lot of the reviews, which in their defense I sorta get, a lot of them were confused about what was actually going on. And that's just mostly because of how the plot is dealt with. There's a few moments here or there where they actually move the plot forward, but a lot of times there's really nothing going on that's actively moving it. So sometimes when something really important happens, it's not entirely sure if you should really care about this moment in particular or anything. And that's mostly because during all that dead space, there's really nothing going on. and the characters are not picking up the pace. Sebastian has an interesting idea of a backstory, but it's only handled through the files, and while it's important for the sequel, we didn't know if there was going to be a sequel. And granted, it's mentioned once in the game, but then it is suddenly dropped there and then. No more references to it. Joseph is barely a character that exists and literally dies near the end. Apparently he's alive, but at the end of the day, does it really even matter when he doesn't actually contribute anything to the plot? Kidman barely appears in the plot, and when she does, it's more that she's there to be more mysterious than actually interesting to the plot, because she knows more than everyone else. And that's not entirely a problem per se, but when that gets in the way of telling us an interesting story, I get to have a problem with it. The other two are there, but unlike, they're more plot devices than actual characters in my opinion. Leslie more so, but that's just how it is. And honestly, without a focal character or group of characters to get all that invested in, the story lacks a core emotional connection. Thus, it was really hard for me to actually feel all that invested in the game's story for all that much. Like, to note about this, horror media kinda requires us to at least give somewhat of a crap about who we are watching, or else it becomes bad horror movies and we're all just waiting for them to die. Like, let me tell you, if you want your horror movie to be good, or at least somewhat decent, make them likable, or at least not total pieces of garbage. Though speaking on investment, the only character the story really gives all that much of a toss about is Ruvik, and well, you know, he's just a piece of shit, so... And like, it's not helped that he was already a dickbag before the shit happened, so it's again, really hard to care. Though to say that he's even a part of this plot is kind of a misnomer because he's barely a part of it too. We rarely see him, and when we do, it's more to be like, though that actually fits his personality and what he's trying to do, does still make him a weak villain. But that's more debate about how we should write characters. Though honestly, if there was a way to really talk about my problem with the story, I feel as though the story had two problems. One, the lack of characters, but the other one is actually more of my problem. You see, that idea about players not understanding what's going on kinda could have worked. See, this game was trying to be more psychological horror, or at least that's kind of where the name comes from, Psycho Break. And well, I think the idea if they went with could have been more interesting, where basically Sebastian doesn't really know what the hell's going on. He might get some ideas, and we may be able to gather context clues from everything going on, but we, the audience, would never have a true understanding of what the hell is going on. Kind of like, trying to give an example of what I'm talking about, Emissions Blue. If you've never seen it, you should watch it. It's a great SFM. It's a really good horror movie, and I think you should totally watch it, because it gets to the idea of what I'm trying to say of what this story could have been more like. And it would have been more interesting because the final scene of the game is really interesting because I kind of like it. I saw one video complain about the ending, and I was like, I felt like it was a good ending. Or at least a good horror ending. Let me elaborate. Because at the end of the day, he didn't win. He just survived. He barely even understood what was going on or why it was even happening to begin with. And at the end, he sees the guy he was trying to kill get away and cause more havoc, and not even sure if he even got out. That's a great ending. Horror sometimes doesn't want to give you a clear answer, nor should it, because sometimes the horror is never knowing. And I think if the story leaned to that, I don't know what's going on and it's driving me mad, that would have made the game way more interesting, because I can only speak for myself because of my own limited knowledge of horror games. Even though I know a lot of horror games, doesn't mean I understand the entire genre. A lot of horror games usually like to explain what we're looking at least to a certain degree. Here we never get a clear-cut answer on what the hell is these things and what's their deal. You know what I mean? But you get the idea. Maybe I'm just speaking out of my ass and saying that direction would have been better. because I honestly could not care much about the plot. And it sucks because there's a good idea here, and it just feels like I don't care. Like, I do not care at all. I could go into more depth about this, but I feel like I would just be spinning my wheels, getting to the same point that I'm just saying right now. Though I should at least go back to talking about Kidman for a moment. Remember how I talked about her being mysterious and more or less being there for the plot to have that mystery but never really bother to explain it? Well, her deal was more dealt with the DLC, which I do want to talk about, and how I'm really annoyed at it, because here's the thing. More times than not, Mobius is just not explained or even mentioned directly at most times. And when it is, it's just a hand wave. You see their symbols, but not understand who they are as a group. The DLC actively explains who they are and Kidman's involvement. Basically, they're a sort of, I don't know how else to explain it other than they're an Illuminati sort of group that just want to take over the world. Yeah, just like that. And I'm only so against this stuff is because it's DLC, which, fuck you for trying to make me pay money just to understand the plot. That you could have just either have made it more understandable or have made it its own separate thing to be some other sort of plot. I'm just getting to the point that this shouldn't have existed. And ironically, from my understanding, this DLC wasn't meant to happen. And I also need to mention that this DLC is important to understand certain plot points in the sequel so that you understand what exactly is this whole deal. So again, it's sort of required, but the game doesn't let you play it because they want you to pay for it. But I've gone on too long about the plot. I've said everything I felt like I wanted to say about the plot. Like, I kind of already spoiled the ending for the game, and it's like, okay, so I'm not going to bother to keep on going on the plot. Let's actually talk about the gameplay and talk about the stuff that I really do want to talk about. So let's actually begin talking about the gameplay, which a lot of people compare to Resident Evil 4. And while I say it's not the most apt comparison, to not use it is to be blind, as I say that it sure does still look like Resident Evil 4. And ironically, there's one comparison that everyone kind of ignores, but we can talk about that comparison later on when we talk about it. But let's actually cover our bases real quick before we talk about it. This game controlled like, ironically, a bunch of third-person shooters, but the best comparison I can choose right here is the Resi remake. Though in this game's case, it actually cares a lot more about stealth, as while you can pull out your guns at times, stealth is preferable as you will need to worry about ammo at times as it's super limited, even into the late game. Kind of. But yeah, the game really does want you to be more stealthy than outright going on the offense, even giving you items to allow you to more easily stealth around foes, and even a stealth kill. Though you gotta be careful on that one, that thing can lock you in, and if you're near a trap, it will set off. Which is really weird because you would think the designers would be more careful about that, but no, apparently not. But anyway, traps. Yeah, let's talk about that. Scattered throughout some of the areas of the game, really depends on which area, as certain areas don't have traps and other ones do, but they're kind of situational. It really just depends on where you are, and you can have a few ways to handling them, either by ignoring them outright, which you can do at your own risk, dismantle them for parts, which we'll talk about in a moment, or maybe use them against enemies to basically deal some damage to them and save resources. I do want to go back for a moment because as much as I mentioned stealth as an important part, it's not like that hard-coded stealth, where basically enemies know where you are at all times. You can actually run away and hide a bit, but how you hide is kind of pointless. Like, halfway through the game, hiding becomes really worthless and you can just go. We'll talk about this more in a bit because I need to talk about one area that I really hate, but we'll talk about that when we get to that. And if you're stealthing right, most of the traps aren't even an issue, as traps are kind of weirdly done where they're put in spots where they're not in an entire inconvenience, but they're just semi-ones. Except leg traps. The early ones in the beginning are hard to see because they blend into the environments really well. And the only time you should ever die to a trap is by accident and never by walking into them. They are total accident. But in any case, if stealth does become a non-option at the moment, you do still have your options of just pulling out a weapon, and you have a decent variety of weapons throughout the entire game, which are just the usual standard survival horror weaponry. You know, the handgun, shotgun, sniper rifle, the whole shebang. Though the more notable one is the Agony Bow, a crossbow that you can find early on, and through the parts you find through traps and just throughout the level, you can actually make bolts that can have various effects, like an electric one that can fry a few enemies, or a bolt that can blind them for an easy stealth kill, or just a really strong steel bolt that just, most times than not, just kills most foes in a one shot. In fact, this weapon becomes the most powerful by the end game. Though that really depends on how you upgrade the weapons. Let's actually talk about that. Scattered throughout the levels or dropped by enemies. Actually, to talk about this now, because not a lot of the reviewers, in fact, I don't think any of the reviewers that I saw talking about this game ever mentioned that the enemies have random drops. That they basically have no set drops to have. Which is very weird, but whatever. Though that can actually cause a problem, because if they don't drop a particular thing you might need, that can cause a bad time. But I'm getting off topic. Sort of. In any case, these gels can be used to upgrade yourself through this chair. And honestly, a lot of people have a problem with the upgrade system, which I get and I also don't get. Let me elaborate. A lot of people didn't like how much it limits you throughout the entire game. For example, how much you can carry. Like, you can carry only a few matches and bullets, which a lot of people said really stretched their disbelief, which in some regard I get, but I also get what it's trying to do. It's trying to limit you so that combat is not your first option, which was one of the things the devs really did want to try to emphasize. And I just realized I didn't explain what matches do in anything in this video. My apologies. Matches allow you to just burn up an enemy or certain things around you that will catch on fire. Why would you do this? Well, mostly because if you catch an enemy on fire, they could catch other enemies on fire and will just instantly kill them. Which is very useful at times, as I've shown in other footage here. But the point is, more times than not, just to make sure that an enemy stays down, because sometimes they can just fake it for a little bit. If you want to know which ones are faking it, it's the ones that are unable to be moved. Those are the ones you need to burn. Nothing more. Although the janky physics for this game are funny, I'm just mentioning that now too. And really, a lot of horror games also try to do this, where they try to limit your inventory, trying to make sure that every fight is not something you want to do. And like the game, as I mentioned, it gives you enough tools to handle most foes with stealth, so ammo isn't that much of an issue too much. Maybe, except bosses, because, well, here's the thing, usually bosses spawn with a lot of enemies and a lot of ammo, so it's not much of an issue, though I see bosses have way too much health and are very tanky, so it will take a while, and that can be very annoying, especially when some of these bosses carry and have one-shot mechanics, which just piss me off because I hate one-shot mechanics in games, because more times than not, they're just evil. But I'm getting off topic. There's also another mechanic other people don't like, where running has a stamina bar, which ironically I have the opposite problem, which let me explain a bit. Yeah, you have a run button and it takes stamina to run, and let me tell ya, you aren't going far with this speed. My original understanding of this mechanic was that it was intended to be more of a get the fuck out at the last moment thing, rather than a general purpose run button. However, one thing I really don't like is how it gets taken away if you're in critical mode. Okay, this is where I sorta need to explain the thing I was talking about earlier about the one way I talked about this game is different than how everyone else talked about it. Here's where we're actually going to talk about it. If you've been watching the video for this long, which, hi, you might have noticed that my gameplay has a lot of ammo, or at least I'm using a lot of it. And you might be wondering, how the hell did I get that much ammo? Well, you see, this is where I need to bring out the thing about how I did that. And I did not cheat or do anything like super lucky or anything. It's because I use the one mechanic in the game that everyone forgets you have or barely even references it, that being your fist, or as I like to call it,
Mega Fist! Mega Fist!
And why do I do that? Well, like Patenkin's move, it's meant to be a stopgapper, or at least stop your opponent from doing anything at the moment so that you can deal more damage. And using it just right can stun your foe for a little bit, allowing you to go and do whatever you want at the moment. Maybe pull out your gun, fire at them, move away to heal a bit, or as I like to do it, just throw another punch, then leave, then repeat this whole cycle again. And sure, if you get hit, not the end of the world. None of the enemies in the game can kill you outright through one attack, except one-shot mechanics, but again, that's beside the point. So you're not even worrying about dying all that much, as health has a minimum requirement, or at least a minimum that you have that you just regen back to if you're below it. Though granted, you have to be standing still while you're doing this, though you can still pull out your gun and aim. As long as you're not moving, you're fine. And doing this really early on saved me a lot of ammo. Sure, my beginning was a little tumultuous because I had forgotten how to do this properly because it's been a while, but I remembered that doing this would save me a lot of ammo. But in any case, you get the idea. And that just carried me throughout the entire game, which kinda subtly changed how I thought about the game in its entirety. If I did stealth, I just did it because I wanted to, not because I needed to. And really, once you have enough ammo, most fights can just go like that. Plus, if you upgrade yourself really well in the early game to make your handgun do headshot damage, or basically just kill them in one shot, you can save even more ammo more and more, and it kind of just landslides into this thing where you're very overpowered, where most foes are not even a problem. And to note, this tactic doesn't always work because sometimes the tactic requires me to be more alone than dealing with a group of enemies, which more times than not isn't not an issue, as most enemies aren't near each other to be a problem. In fact, speaking of the game's layout, enemies are kind of spread out throughout the entire area, so even if you kind of go into a firefight with one enemy, a good chunk of the other enemies won't notice, which is sort of a problem because the game kind of does want you to discourage outright fighting, but only sometimes. It's very weird like that. And to go back to my whole thing about the punch thing, I understand why most players don't even look at it. I mean, really, it doesn't seem that good, and somewhere I mentioned in some other video, I probably can't remember, melee in a lot of survival horror games kind of gets always ignored, mostly because it's worthless and is more of a absolute last weapon sort of deal, rather than any sort of weapon that you actively have to consider. Though in my defense, also, the game does give you the ability to upgrade your fist, so it kind of made me thought, okay, they made it so that it can be upgraded, so there must be some sort of use for it, like, right? And, well, it really did, making some of the levels kind of a joke that I would just mess around with, seeing what I can or cannot do. And it also made me realize about how this game is sort of designed in such a weird way at times. Like, for example, throughout the level, sometimes you'll have Joseph with you at times, and he can help you out in combat. But the AI kind of just ignores him at times, and he'll just do whatever. Like, here's this weird moment where I was trying to use Joseph to abuse him, where basically this whole area will infinitely respawn enemies. And it's like, I was seeing what exactly could Joseph do, and how I could use to abuse him. Which, you can. It's just very difficult because you need to be in a weird spot where he can and will want to do it. And it's very weird like that. Though speaking on the level, usually a level in and of itself or chapter will usually follow a certain sort of theme. Like, for example, the first few levels are tutorial levels. There's one that's later on all about leaving an area, or chapter 9 that is just the absolute worst, where you're stuck in a mansion and Ruvik's there, who also can insta-kill you whenever he wants, and there's really no way to stop him because he could just teleport, and his teleport mechanic is so bullshit because he could just teleport in front of you, and you will have no time to respond to it. and it's just the worst level. I really hated it. The puzzles were kind of fine, but let's actually talk about that for a moment. The puzzles throughout the game are kind of okay. I wouldn't say they're good, but I wouldn't call them outright bad. It's basically, do the thing. Like, obviously, you know what I mean? Though speaking of the chapters and their levels, I do think the game looks good, even till today. Like, sure, it has aged in some weird spots, and the weird choice for the black bars, which add literally nothing to the game. Like, straight up, they just make the game weird to look at, and just harder to see everything, because it does limit your ability to see things. And, like, straight up, I originally thought they were there for performance stuff, but apparently not, because later on they were able to remove them with no problem, which is really weird. Though speaking on performance, the PC version just runs weird. Like, I'm not sure what's wrong with it per se, but it is running at a weird way. But back to the game's look. It looks really good. Like, it has that, I don't know what to call it, that grunge horror look, where everything is just this dirty thing. And it really does add to the game because of just the nature of the horror it's trying to do, and, well, I do think it does its job really well. The enemy designs can use a little touch up here or there, but otherwise I think they're fine. But the bosses are really well done, and I do think they're good. Really good. And the level design of each area does feel different, where you never feel like you're stuck on doing one particular thing for way too long. Though I will say this, while the game starts to be a little more stealthy at the beginning, it does lose that over time. It doesn't throw it out entirely, but by the end of the game, you'll be mostly doing a lot of action-y stuff. And that's not a bad thing, but it's like, there, so you know. And I do like how the game does flip-flop a bit at times, where it decides on what it wants to do. It doesn't have a perfect balance of where it feels like it's never dull or samey for too long, but it does it well enough, in my opinion, where this balance can work well. Not too well, but again, well enough. Though, something I realized in after the fact, because this is something that I just only noted while I was editing, because this is where I usually would add music and usually begin thinking about it, trying to formulate my thoughts. I then realized while trying to find the soundtrack for this game, is that this game doesn't have a soundtrack. Or at least, any songs in it are just not the primary focus, because really, this game is really silent throughout most of it. Which is not a problem, as more times than not you're doing this so that you can focus on the atmosphere. I'm just making the point that I just didn't notice this until way after the fact, which might be a good thing, in that sense of making sure that players are focusing on what the situation's going on rather than focusing on the music as well. Just a choice, but I'm not sure if it was the right choice. It's a very unknown for me. Okay, I'm adding this post-editing because now I found something that was really weirding me out, because this is just something I'm not understanding. Okay, so I found the official soundtrack, and it barely has a few songs, like less than 10 if we're talking about just the base game, because 2 of them are just repeats of the same song, but I'm getting off topic. Point is, if you actually go for the game rip version, which has all the songs, it has a variation of these songs, which I'm very confused on why they're just not in the soundtrack. It's very weird. Somebody might want to try to explain this to me. But at the end of the day, the evil within is fine. While I think its story is interesting and could have gone in a really interesting direction, I think the story is just too muddled for its own good to really have a good central focus that would have been interesting. The gameplay is well enough. It's survival horror at its okayness, where basically it knows what it wants to be and tries to do it, but otherwise has its problems.